What's the most insane coincidence that actually happened to you? In the late 1990s and early 2000s, I went to college with a group of cool guys. We were all into bikes and ATVs, and there was a Yamaha dealership near campus. Sometimes, we would stop by between classes to kill time and admire all the machines we couldn't afford. After we graduated, we stayed in touch for a couple of years, but eventually we drifted apart. It happens. About a decade later, I was in the same town near that Yamaha dealership, waiting while my daily driver was getting some warranty work. I needed an oil filter for our ranch ATV, so the timing worked out perfectly. I was looking around, once again admiring all the things I could probably afford but had long since become too impractical to justify. That's when I ran into Pete. He lived within a few miles of the dealership and had stopped in to look for a chain for his bike. We were reminiscing about old times and talking about what a coincidence it was when we both heard a familiar voice. Our friend Jim. Jim was in town visiting his family and was also killing time, feeling nostalgic, so he had wandered in to check out the inventory. For a moment, it felt like old times, but we were all a bit unsettled by how strange the coincidence was. We exchanged numbers again and promised to stay in touch. Pete and I kept up for a while, but we never heard from Jim. Now, another decade has passed, and I hope those guys are doing well. Story 2. One night in university, I was fooling around with my then-girlfriend and noticed that the brightness of the TV caused us to cast distinct shadows on the wall behind us. Being 19 and a fool, I took this opportunity to take a picture, using Snapchat, of the shadow my dong made on the wall and sent the picture to my best friend. I thought it would elicit an interesting reaction, but could not have prepared for what was next. You see, on Snapchat, you can see when someone receives your message as well as when it's opened. So, as my message was sending, still unopened by him, I received a Snapchat from my best friend. I opened it, and lo and behold, what do I see? A shadow snap of his Woody. This man decided at the exact same time that I did to send an identical picture of his dong's shadow on the wall. Both of our girlfriends were confused, thinking it was some inside joke, when in reality we had never spoken of or sent shadow dong ever before. Story 3. When I was 18, I bought a guitar amp from a shop near where my aunt lived while we were visiting. The amp had originally belonged to the sales guy, who had a pair and was selling one to get some other gear. After several years of use, I bought a few more amps, and this one ended up sitting unused in my basement for a decade before I finally decided to get rid of it to make some room. In the meantime, I had also moved to a new city even farther from where I had originally bought the amp. So, one Saturday, after owning the amp for 22 years, I threw the amp and my kids in the car and headed up to a music store in town I had never been to. They advertised trade-ins, so I wanted to check it out. I was showing the amp to the owner and explaining how I had originally come across it when a worker in the store asked over my shoulder, "Excuse me, did you say you bought the amp at?" I turned, took one look at him and said, "It was you. Do you want your amp back?" It was the same guy, 22 years later, in a totally different city. What were the odds that I would pick that store on a day he happened to be helping out? He was in total shock. Story 4. I was once mugged by 4 guys on one of the main shopping streets in Nairobi, Kenya. One of them had me on hold, and just before I was about to pass out, they dropped me and ran. At the time, I didn't know why. 12 months later, sitting on a beach on an island in Thailand, I met a British couple who did business in Kenya. We started talking about how dangerous it had become for foreigners. They described an incident the year before, when they turned a corner and saw a white guy being mugged, only for a shopkeeper to rescue him by hitting one of the attackers over the head with a bat. They were on the same street, on the same day, at the exact same time I was there. It was me they had witnessed being mugged. The odds of randomly meeting them on a beach in Thailand a year later? Mind-blowing. Story 5. I went to college at my father's alma mater, State Technology College. I studied Russian. No one in my family had any connection to the language. I was later offered the chance to study in Moscow. After graduating, I went to Moscow to live and study for 4 months. My college Russian professor prepared me for life there, including putting me in contact with one of her private students, Joanne, who was living and working in Moscow at the time. This was just before email and the internet and long before social media. One day, that girl and I were walking down a street in Moscow. a street I had never been to before and never visited again. We passed an older couple, and I instantly felt like I recognized them. I stopped, turned around, and saw the woman looking back at me. Years later, I found out she was staring because I was wearing a t-shirt that said Hilton Head, South Carolina, which she thought was strange to see in Moscow. The older woman said, in American accented English, "Do I know you?" I answered, in my own American accented English, "I think so." We started walking toward each other. By the time I reached them, the names Bob and Kelly popped into my head, so I said, "Bob and Kelly?" With surprised looks on their faces, Bob and Kelly said, "Yes." Then it hit me how I knew them. They had audited the very first Russian language class I took in college exactly 2 years earlier. We had only used first names in that class, and I had thought of them as Bob and Kelly, the two older people who butchered the Russian language. Bob, Kelly, Joanne, and I shared a good laugh over the coincidence of 4 people, all taught Russian by the same woman in our American hometown, meeting each other in Moscow. Wouldn't our teacher have been proud? Bob and Kelly were a lovely couple, so they asked where I was living. It turned out I lived only 1 or 2 metro stops away from them, nowhere near where we were standing. They asked for my contact information so they could invite me over for dinner. I wrote down my name and details, explaining how to ask for me since I lived in a school-run building where none of the staff spoke English. Bob looked at my unusual last name, Kerflugenhausen, and said, "Kerflugenhausen? I went to State Technology College with a couple of Kerflugenhausens." Shaking my head and judging by Bob's age, I said, "Yeah, that would either be my Uncle Frank or my father, Klaus." "Klaus and Renata Kerflugenhausen are your parents?" "Yep. I was a fraternity brother of your father. I knew your parents very well when I was in school." By this time, Bob Turner had given me his name and contact information on a piece of paper, and my brain was spinning, trying to place why it sounded so familiar. I mean, Bob Turner isn't exactly a unique name. Then, suddenly, ding. I knew where I had seen his name before. I reached into my purse and pulled out a photo of my mother from before she was married, back when she was dating my father. She was wearing an adorable party dress. The story I had been told was that my father was busy working and couldn't take her to this dance or party, so she went with one of his fraternity brothers. I turned the photo over, and there was Bob Turner's name written on the back. I held up the photo and asked, "Is this you?" Bob was flabbergasted. "That's me and your mother," he stammered. At this point, Kelly, Bob's second wife, who didn't know all his college friends, gave us a side eye and said, "Bob, she's carrying around a photo of you?" I laughed and replied, "I'm carrying around my favorite photo of my mother. I never cared who the guy in it was. Until now." I wrote the story up and sent it home to my parents. By fax. Baby. My father got a lot of mileage out of telling it during homecoming weekend parties with his fraternity brothers. It was even written up inaccurately in the fraternity newsletter that year. Bob and Kelly never got around to inviting me over for dinner. That was the only time I saw them in Moscow. 13 years later, Bob showed up at my mother's memorial service. He was a widower by then and visiting with his children. It was his custom to read obituaries, and when he saw my mother's, he came and stayed for the repast as well. My father passed away 11 years later, and I can't remember if we managed to notify him. Daddy's service was in his hometown, so I didn't expect Bob to attend. My Uncle Frank just passed away last week, and I've already seen on Facebook that someone was able to get the news to Bob. The service will be in their hometown again, so I don't expect to see him. Besides, he should be about 83 now. Story 6. When I was a baby, my mother gave me up for adoption. She already had a 10-year-old son and was going through a very difficult time in her life. Fast forward 20 years. I was a junior in college and knew almost nothing about my birth family, except for my mother's and brother's first names. I had never even seen a picture of them. That Christmas, my adoptive mom gave me an Ancestry DNA kit. When the results came back, my top match was a man named Vincent. I looked him up on Facebook and thought, damn, this guy looks like me. I sent him a message explaining everything, and he immediately knew I was his brother. That part wasn't the coincidence. After a bit of messaging, we realized we lived only about 10 minutes apart. We decided to meet that night and reconnect. Turns out we both attend the same university and have the same major and minor. He had decided to return to school and finish his degree 10 years later, and he happened to choose my university. All this time, we thought we were living on opposite sides of the country. It really makes you think about nature versus nurture. We have a great relationship now, and it's amazing to finally have an older brother. I also learned that I have a younger brother on my mother's side and another older brother on my biological father's side. Story 7. A few years back, my dad traveled to Denmark for a business trip. My mom, being Danish, decided to go with him. She had always heard stories about the relatives who never moved to America, but she had no idea where they lived or whether any of them were still around. After about a week in the country, my parents were driving down a rural road when their car got a flat tire. There wasn't much cell reception, so they walked up a nearby driveway to ask the homeowners if they could use their phone. They climbed the steps of a small cottage and knocked. An elderly woman answered. The moment she saw my mom, her eyes lit up, and she immediately hugged her. My parents were confused, and the woman's husband was just as excited. The couple spoke very little English, but they guided my parents down the main hallway to a guest room. On the dresser was a photograph of my mom and her brothers from their high school graduation. The elderly couple were my mother's great-aunt and great-uncle, the ones who had never moved to the United States. To this day, my parents still can't explain how they happened to stumble onto their exact home. Story 8. I have two. The first was in Mexico when I was 16. At the resort, there was a place to paint pottery, and I was there with my dad, who was sitting across from me. Next to us sat another father and his daughter, and they were from our hometown. I asked the daughter which high school she attended, and it turned out to be the school my recent ex went to. Then I found out she was his current girlfriend. We both thought it was wild and kind of fun, while our dads were baffled that an ex and a current girlfriend were happily chatting. The second coincidence happened at work. One of my coworkers was my age, and his birthday was 2 days before mine. I asked where he was born, and he said a military hospital in Oklahoma, the same hospital where I was born. We realized we had been in the same nursery, just a few feet apart. It was one of the coolest moments of my life. Story 9. I spent a few months living in the south of Spain last year while doing a teaching internship. Before that, I had taught in my hometown in the UK and given some one-to-one tutoring sessions to students learning English as a foreign language. One of my students was a really cool Spanish guy who had moved to the UK to work and improve his English. I taught him for about a year, and we became good friends and got along really well. Eventually, he moved back to his hometown in central Spain, and we didn't keep in touch much after that. I rarely heard from him. Fast forward about a year, and I moved to Spain for the internship. One day, I was sitting with a friend in a local park on a beautiful sunny morning, having coffee and breakfast, when I glanced toward the main gate and saw my former student walking in with a friend. We both did a double take, then ran toward each other asking, "What are you doing here?" It turned out the friend he was with was from the city I was living in, and he was visiting for the weekend. It was one of the strangest coincidences that he chose that specific city, went to that exact park, at the exact moment I happened to be there, after we hadn't seen each other for a year and were now in a completely different country. Story 10. My family has a cabin, and when I was about 11, my dad and I went fishing at a pond a short drive from there. When we finished for the day, my dad wanted to take the more direct route back, which was about a 5-minute drive. I wanted to take the back roads instead. They were more scenic, but took about 15 minutes. After I spent a while being an annoying little kid, my dad finally agreed to take the back roads. So we kept driving and eventually reached the road that leads to our cabin. As we came over a hill, we saw a crowd gathered around a tractor trailer that had gone off the highway and jumped the barrier onto the access road. A bunch of people from our campground were standing around it. The crash was right in front of the entrance to the campground, on the stretch of road we would have taken if we'd gone the direct way. My dad asked someone in the crowd what had happened, and they said that about 10 minutes earlier, the truck had gone over the barrier, crashed, and rolled. 10 minutes earlier was almost exactly when my dad and I would have been driving through there. Story 11. When I was 13, my grandmother passed away. After the funeral, we had a send-off party at my parents' house to celebrate her life, and the whole family was there. I was feeling sad and overwhelmed, so I went outside to be alone. I stood on the driveway beneath a big cherry tree in full bloom, its pink flowers everywhere. The tree was actually a huge pain because the petals would fall, get crushed, and turn into a gross, slippery pulp. I stood there feeling lost and guilty. I hadn't had a chance to say goodbye to my grandmother before she died, and I held my hands open in front of me in a "what am I even doing here" gesture, silently wishing I had said goodbye. No sooner had I done that than a single flower fell from the tree and landed squarely in my palm. It felt like a small message from my grandma, and I still think of her whenever I see those trees. Story 12. I was in Kathmandu for a semester abroad program. A friend and I were in a barbershop waiting for our haircuts when we noticed another Westerner getting his done, wearing Jackson Hole croquis. This was the 80s. My friend noticed and told me a story about how he had been out there a year or two earlier on a massive powder day and had wiped out. He searched everywhere, but couldn't find one of his skis. Eventually, he gave up and asked someone from the mountain what to do. They told him to leave his address and the details of the ski, and when the snow melted in the spring, if they found it, they would send it. Sure enough, come June, the ski arrived. The guy in the chair whipped his head around and asked, "Wait a minute, was it on blankety-blank run, and was it a blankety-blank ski?" My friend nodded. I found that ski. Minds were officially blown. Even 30 years later, we still see each other from time to time and have to remind each other that it really happened. Story 13. When I was young, in England, my mum would drive me to school every day. Every day, we would see a girl a few years older than me walking the exact same route to school with her mother. We always talked about stopping to offer them a lift, but we never did, until one day when it was raining heavily. Her mother agreed and thanked us, but the young girl pulled back and convinced her mother not to get in the car. So they walked instead. We never understood why the girl didn't want to get in, but we assumed she was just scared. Now, I'm living in Amsterdam, and I saw on Facebook that a childhood friend of mine was in town, so I messaged her and we arranged to meet up. She was here with her lifelong best friend, and we all got along really well. Her friend and I started talking and discovered that we had attended the same primary and secondary schools. I told her the story about the little girl and her mother, and she started screaming and crying. It was her. It turned out she had been too embarrassed to get in the car with us because she didn't want us to think they were poor. She said her mother still laughs about it, and they had always wondered who it was that stopped to offer them a lift that day. Story 14. This is by far the strangest coincidence I've experienced. About a year ago, my husband and I were shopping at Walmart when we noticed an older couple who seemed to be in almost all the same aisles as us. I joked to my husband that it was us 40 years in the future since the wife was wearing Victoria's Secret pink sweatpants like mine and carrying a purse from the same brand. We ended up passing each other in the dog food aisle, buying the same brand of dog food and treats as we had. Finding the humor in the moment, we struck up a conversation with them. We discovered that, like us, they have one daughter with a very rare 4-syllable first name, just like our daughter. They also have 2 dogs, including a German Shepherd Beagle mix, just like ours. Okay, this is where things got even stranger. We live next to XYZ High School, and they live next to XYZ Elementary School a couple of miles from us. After we finished our small talk, we checked out and headed to our vehicle to load the groceries. Parked right next to us was an identical make, model, and year car as mine. The only difference was that this one was red and mine is blue. I joked to my husband again, maybe this car belongs to our future selves from inside the store. And sure enough, who comes out of the store and gets into the car next to us? You guessed it. Their car even had body damage on the right side, just like mine. It was an absolutely eerie experience, almost like we had met ourselves in an alternate dimension or timeline. Story 15. My son is a year and a half old now, and this happened about a year ago when he was still brand new. I live in mid-Michigan, but my family has been spread all over the state since I was born. When I was a kid, my uncle lived pretty far north, still under the bridge, with his first wife. I haven't seen his ex-wife since I was little. My mom married my stepdad about 14 years ago, and he has siblings in Kalkaska. I hadn't seen them since about a year before my son was born. Keep in mind, my uncle is on my mom's side, so there's zero connection to the Kalkaska side, and they have never met each other. Well, my uncle still talks to his ex-wife. One day, she walks into a diner looking for her friend, and while she's there, she decides to show off her new pseudo-great nephew. She starts chatting with a waitress who also wants to show off her new nephew. They both pull up the same picture, a picture of my son. My son, whom neither of them has ever met. My son, who lives half a state away. My son, whose father they haven't seen in years. And somehow he is actually both of their nephews. The waitress was my stepdad's sister. It absolutely blew my mind. Story 16. When I was about 12, I went to a summer camp on the coast of North Carolina where we learned about sailing Jesus and other stuff. I was a small, reserved kid, didn't really get to know many people, and was a little skittish about getting in the water or taking my shirt off in front of others since I was chubby. My counselor was really cool and always helped me summon the courage to do things. He called me Little Bro. He was this hippie guy who looked like the lead singer from Blind Melon, and he had 2 pet iguanas. On one of the last nights of camp, I decided to sit by the shore after sunset. I noticed my counselor down on the jetty, smoking a cigarette. I walked over and talked to him for a few minutes. He was really a cool guy. Fast forward 10 years. I was working at a Mexican restaurant, and after a few months, they had me train a new guy. He looked to be about my age and had a shaved head like mine. I taught him the ropes, and we started hanging out after work at the local Buffalo Wild Wings. One night, the trivia question on the screen was about sailing. I was halfway through a few drinks, so I rambled about how I should have known the answer because I had gone to a summer camp as a kid. I went on to describe my counselor, the hippie guy with the 2 pet iguanas and all that. My friend looked at me and said, "I can't believe you're saying what you're saying, bro. 10 years ago, I worked at that camp. I had long hair at the time, and I had 2 pet iguanas. One was mine, and one was my girlfriend's." Mind blown. But there's more. After finding this out, he encouraged me to go back to the camp as a counselor, saying it was such an amazing experience. I applied, and he even called the camp director to put in a good word for me. I ended up working there for the summer. Every week, we had a new group of campers, and on the last week, I decided to walk out to my old spot by the jetty to smoke my final cigarette. As I stood there, one of my campers from that week, a small kid who didn't say much and needed a little encouragement to get in the water, just like I had, peeked out from the tree line by the shore and saw me standing on the jetty. He walked up, and we talked for a while. I hope he thought I was a really cool guy, too. Story 17. My husband and I honeymooned in Malta last year, where his father was born and had never returned. We had been given the contact information for one of his Maltese cousins to connect with while we were there. We booked our Airbnb in February and contacted them in April to let them know we were coming. We met up with them, and they showed us around different parts of the country. We booked 2 places, one on the island of Gozo and another in Valletta. Backstory. When we checked into the Valletta place, the instructions said 2nd floor. In Canada, the 1st floor is usually the ground level, and the numbering goes upward from there. So, we tried our key in the apartment on the 2nd floor. It didn't work. We saw a Filipino woman enter the apartment, so we knew we had the wrong place since we weren't meeting anyone for check-in. We walked up to the next floor, and sure enough, the 2nd floor was what we would have understood in Canada to be the 3rd floor. One day, they said they wanted to take us around the city of Valletta and show us the building where my father-in-law's last living aunt was residing, perhaps even meet her, as she was well into her 90s. When we gave them our Airbnb address so they could come meet us, they were completely blown away. It turned out that our Airbnb was not only in the same building, but our rental was the apartment directly above my husband's great aunt. That meant that when we had tried the 2nd floor apartment earlier, it had actually been my husband's great aunt's place. And the Filipino woman we had seen was her live-in caretaker. Needless to say, we were able to meet her. She was so shocked to meet her sister's grandson, and it became an incredibly special part of our honeymoon. His dad, who was 72 at the time, was able to see photos of us with his aunt, whom he hadn't seen since he was about 7, when his family left Malta to move to the States. Both my father-in-law and his aunt passed away very recently, and my husband and I cherish this coincidental experience so much. Story 18. About 5 or 6 years ago, I went camping in Sequoia with some college friends. There, I met a group of guys from Spain, and we hit it off, talking about all sorts of topics. I exchanged Facebook accounts with 2 of them, since the others didn't have one. I learned they were backpacking, so access to a phone was limited, and we didn't exchange numbers. At the end of the trip, I said goodbye and went home. Fast forward to 2017. I was on a trip to Uruguay walking down the street in my mom's hometown when I spotted a USB drive. It had the logo of a local construction company on it. At the time, I needed one to take to a print shop for some flyers and thought, wow, how lucky. I looked around to see if anyone had dropped it, but the area was empty. I picked it up and took it home, skeptical about plugging it into my laptop in case it had viruses or other strange content. I ended up just emailing the files to the print shop, so I didn't need the USB, nor did I check what was on it, until the last week of my trip out of curiosity. There were some photos of friends, a cat, plants, and nothing unusual, as well as a resume. I contacted the number on the resume via WhatsApp, a very common app outside the USA, saying, "Hey, name on resume, I found your USB and am reaching out via the number I found on your resume. Can I meet you to return it?" I received no response, flew back to the States, and forgot about the message. A few weeks later, I got a whole response. "Hi, Ariana, it's random name, let's say Jorge. It's been a while since we last spoke. How are you doing?" Name of his friend. Do you remember him? He finally made it back home, and other friend went to random country. In my sleepy days, I didn't connect any of this. I apologized for not contacting him sooner and said I couldn't return the USB. He said he didn't mind, it wasn't even his, and once again excitedly asked how I was doing. Finally, I read the messages over again, and it all clicked. This was one of the guys I had met in that group of Spaniards at Sequoia 5 or 6 years ago, the ones who didn't have a Facebook account or phone. The names he mentioned were the friends I had met. He recognized me via the photo icon on my WhatsApp account. I even asked him for a selfie to confirm his identity, and it was him. I had to sit down and freak out because how his resume from Spain ended up on a street in Uruguay on a random USB is a complete mystery. He still has no clue how it got there, and he has never once visited Uruguay in his life. Story 19. In freshman physics, I became friends with the Japanese kid sitting next to me. After a while, he started helping me with my Japanese homework. I ended up doing really well, by the way. After that class, we drifted apart. Fast forward 2 years. I'm an exchange student in Japan over the summer, sightseeing in Kyoto after the program. I'm crossing the street when I hear my name being called. I look around, and there he is. Thousands of miles apart, we meet again. We grabbed some drinks and enjoyed good food together. It was a blast. No, his hometown wasn't Kyoto. He was also sightseeing while home for the summer. Story 20. My family used to take little summer vacations. One summer, when I was about 7 or 8, we stayed at a campground about 4 hours from home. There were a bunch of kids there, and one day we all started playing tag. I was it, and was chasing another young boy. When I tagged him, I pushed him too hard, and he fell and broke his arm. I remember the scene vividly. Fast forward to college. I became good friends with my neighbor in the dorm, and we ended up getting a place together our sophomore year. The following year, no longer living together, we went out for a few beers, and the topic of broken bones came up. He said, "I've only broken one bone, and it was my arm when I was 7. Some kid at a campground pushed me over while playing tag. It was me. I still can't believe it." Story 21. A few years ago, I got into a cab heading out for the evening in downtown Toronto. Shortly after being dropped off, I realized I had left my phone in the cab. I tried calling it with no luck. I called the cab company, but because I had flagged the cab and paid cash, they had no real way of knowing which cab I was in. I figured the phone was as good as gone and went about my night. Many hours later, after moving around the city quite a bit, I was ready to call it a night, so I flagged another cab. Sitting in the back seat, I started to think the driver looked familiar and realized I was in the same cab I had taken earlier. He hadn't found a phone, but I started looking anyway, and sure enough, there it was. Jammed in the seat. Me and my flip phone were happily reunited, only for me to put it in a washing machine 2 days later. Story 22. About 10 years ago, I tried to get into Six Flags with a tiny keychain Swiss Army knife. It literally had a dull 1-inch blade. They told me I could either throw it away, take it to my car a mile away, or rent a locker for about $10. So I decided to hide it in a planter. I looked down and saw a big piece of bark in the dirt and figured it would be a good hiding place. I picked it up and found another mini Swiss Army knife. I placed mine next to the first and went into the park. When I returned, the other knife was gone, and a smiley face was etched into the dirt in its place. Story 23. I'm an American who moved to Amsterdam some years ago. During my first year there, on a random Saturday, I decided to head out for a drink. I sat down next to a cute German guy who was in town for the first time, having traveled 6 hours to help a friend move. It turns out he's doing a PhD in physics. I'm doing mine in astronomy and have a physics background. So we spent about 10 minutes discussing our research. Then he mentioned, almost offhand, that he used to study in New Zealand. I get a confused look, then get all excited. "Johannes, Prof W's E&M class in Auckland. First half of 2007. I freaked him out until I explained. I had been a semester abroad student in Auckland that year. Not only were we in the same class, we even did homework together and such. We lost touch once I left the country, with no one knowing what happened to the other, only to randomly run into each other 5 years later in a random bar in a random city on another continent. I don't know if I can ever top that one. It was pretty darn cool. Story 24. I once went camping with about 5 other friends around 3 years ago in Pisgah National Forest in the mountains of North Carolina. The area has some amazing waterfalls, one called Rainbow Falls, which drops about 125 feet from the river above to the ground below. If you keep hiking past Rainbow Falls, there's a much smaller waterfall in the river above called Turtleback Falls. It's basically a very slippery rock with water running over it, ending in a 4 to 5 foot drop. What's really cool is that you can climb up it using a rope someone attached to a tree above, walk out to the middle of the rock, and slide down. There's also another spot about 1/3 of the way up the side of Rainbow Falls where you can climb up some branches, then basically rappel down a rock face, shimmy out on a ledge, and jump about 30 to 40 feet into the deep pool in the river at the bottom of the waterfall. One time, my friends and I had climbed out on the ledge and were about to jump when we noticed another group of people hanging out in the river below us. They started cheering us on and encouraging us to jump. It's slightly terrifying after all. We ended up jumping, and once we were in the river below, we talked with some of the other group. They seemed pretty cool. Fast forward 1 year. We had so much fun the year before that we decided to go back. This time, we camped a little further down the river and decided to climb on some rocks about 300 to 400 yards from the waterfall. While I was climbing on one rock, I noticed something that looked like a strap. Assuming it was trash, I didn't touch it, but when I pointed it out to one of my friends, he realized it was actually a GoPro camera in a waterproof case. He decided to keep it. Fast forward a couple of days. My friend and I bought a charger for that type of camera and decided to see what was on it. We started watching the video and saw some guys climbing up the same spot where we had jumped off the side of the waterfall, with the cameraman climbing behind them. As the cameraman got closer, we noticed something that made us instantly freak out. On the back left shoulder of the person in front of the camera was the exact tattoo my friend has. When the camera got even closer, we realized that the person on screen was my friend, who was sitting right next to me. Later, the cameraman reached the ledge and we saw me and the rest of our group from over a year earlier. There were even photos and videos of us jumping from the ledge. We watched the rest of the video in a stunned state. The last 30 minutes or so of the footage showed the cameraman going up to the river above Rainbow Falls and sliding on Turtleback Falls, apparently losing his GoPro in the water after going over the falls. The camera sank to the bottom and you could even see fish swimming by and staring at it. Now think about where we found the camera, 400 to 500 yards downriver from the bottom of the large waterfall. So apparently this camera made its way down the river, over a 125-foot waterfall, and got lodged in a rock 400 to 500 yards away. My friends and I found it a year later, complete with video footage of us from the previous year on it. It took us a little while to decide that this was the most reasonable explanation. Edit 1. Everyone is asking me to post the video and pictures. My friend still has the camera. I asked him about it and he said he thinks he's saved it to his computer. I'm at work right now. Check back later. I think I should be able to get a hold of them. Edit 2. A lot of people are wondering if I knew the cameraman. The answer is no, I did not. I suspect he was one of the people I mentioned being at the bottom of the river while we were about to jump. We jumped off this rock multiple times, so he might have followed us up one of the times, although I don't specifically remember this. Edit 3. For anyone still interested, my friend says he can't find the videos on his computer, but he is trying to recover them from the GoPro. Story 25. When I was 13, I was on a family holiday in Venice. We were on a gondola touring the waterways of the city. About halfway down a long passage, another gondola passed us, carrying a man and a woman, and the punter. The man and my dad locked eyes, exclaimed each other's names, and shared a quick handshake as our gondolas passed. My brother, mother, and I sat quietly, pretty stunned, while the woman on the other boat exploded. "What? Who's that? How do you know him?" We floated off in the other direction, comparatively swag and chill. It turned out he was a guy my dad had gone to university with, and he hadn't seen him since. They still haven't contacted each other since. It's crazy that they recognized each other, considering they were both in their late 40s, passing fleetingly on 2 gondolas in Venice. Story 26. A few years ago, when I had just become a bartender and was getting into the whole, oh my god, is it really that easy to get women's numbers phase, I ended up getting a girl's number one night and another girl's number the next night. I went ahead and started texting both of them, blatantly using the same phrases and just changing the names. However, come Monday morning, the bomb dropped. It turned out not only did they go to the same university, but they were in the same year, the same class, and were currently partners on some sort of assignment. They were not as amused as I was. This is how the conversation went. Me, texting both girls. So, want to get some ice cream later? I typed. Girl A replied, I don't know, why don't you ask Chloe? Placeholder name, I couldn't remember it for the life of me. Girl B chimed in, I don't know, why don't you ask blah blah? Creativity is not my strong suit. Me, still texting both. Bring her along, we can make it a party, I suggested. A couple of messages later, both girls were texting back, calling me disgusting, a loser, and so on. But the story doesn't end there. Fast forward a couple of years. I'm at a restaurant with some friends when we bump into a mutual friend of ours. He's with a couple of girls. Hey, come sit with us, I called out. We all start chatting away, happily making friends. I cozy up to one girl and we start talking and flirting a bit. I tell her, I'm a bartender. She laughs and says, I'll never date a bartender because of this one guy that... She suddenly stops, freezes, and looks at me. It turns out it was Girl A, and not enough time had passed to heal this particular wound. She got up and stormed off, never to be seen again. But wait, there's more. Fast forward about a year. I go out clubbing, drunk off my face, and meet a girl. We hit it off. The next morning, I wake up, and lo and behold, it's Girl A. She's still not as amused as I am about the situation. Edit. So, Girl A and I talked for a few days after the third time we met, but then she abruptly ended contact with me. I think it was more on principle than anything else. I haven't spoken to or seen her in nearly 2 years. To all those suggesting that Girl A and I should get together, definitely run that by my amazing girlfriend first and see what happens. Story 27. I've written about this before, but I still think it's insane, so here goes. When I was a little kid, my parents would take my sister and me to visit my great-grandmother in the nursing home. She was in her mid-90s, blind, and, at least to young me, basically terrifying. I hated going to see her, to be honest. Every time we went, she would touch our faces, because she was blind, and talk to us a little. Meanwhile, her roommate somehow knew my name and would always try to hold me, even though my parents never said more than pleasantries to her. It always freaked me out. Fast forward to my mid-20s. My dad casually mentions that the roommate was his grandmother and my other great-grandmother. She didn't actually know my name. I was a junior and looked like my dad, so she thought I was him. She was senile after all. Apparently there had been a falling out when my dad was a kid, and he had no relationship with much of his extended family. She didn't recognize my dad because she'd never seen him as an adult. The messed up part is they lived in a city nursing home, a pretty big city too, and just by sheer unbelievable coincidence, my parents' grandparents ended up as roommates. Story 28. I live in Australia and have for almost my whole life, but I was born in Dubai. Every weekend there, my mum would take me to the Hilton Beach Club and sit me in front of the pastry chef while I ate. We moved away from Dubai really early on, so I don't even remember much. Fast forward to when I was 17. A new kid had just moved to our school from a nearby town. We became friends and both loved cricket, practicing a lot together. One day, my dad and I were giving him a lift home after practice, and my dad asked, "Where were you born?" He said, "Dubai." The conversation continued, and I mentioned I was born there too. Then he added, "My parents used to be the pastry chefs at the Hilton Beach Club." I was blown away. 16 years later, halfway across the world, I had spent every weekend of my early childhood sitting in front of his parents, eating what they made. To this day, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I mean, what are the chances? Story 29. This happened to me a few months ago, and it was pretty damn improbable. I was walking through BART, Bay Area Rapid Transit, where an average of about 375,000 people pass through every day. I was heading up the escalator toward my train when I noticed an envelope lying on the ground. At first, I didn't think much of it, but after a couple steps, I turned back and picked it up anyway. The next part freaked me out. I looked at the address, and it was addressed to me. I instantly looked around, half expecting a prank or an assassination attempt or something, but nope, nothing like that. The sender was a family friend we'll call the Johnsons. I knew Mr. Johnson took BART daily, but I had never actually run into him before. After work, I called him and asked about the letter. Turns out he had around 300 letters with him on BART that day and was planning to mail them out for his daughter's graduation party. So, what are the chances that he dropped the one letter addressed to me, and that I, out of roughly 375,000 daily riders, was the one who happened to pick it up? Pretty wild. Story 30. I was with my ex for 4 years. We're both from the same hometown in Europe and spent the end of high school and the first 2 years of college together. She broke up with me, left her studies, and became a flight attendant. Fast forward 3 years. I get my degree and run into her in our hometown. We hadn't spoken in 3 years. She had been flying around Europe. She tells me she's about to accept a job offer in Saudi Arabia. I say, cool. I wouldn't go if I were a woman, but hey, you're freaking crazy, so have fun. 2 months later, I get an amazing job offer in Saudi Arabia and, of course, accept. Here's the coincidence. We arrive in the same Saudi Arabian city 2 days apart, live in the same compound, just 2 minutes away from each other in a huge city. All my colleagues think it's adorable, but I want nothing to do with her because my current girlfriend is way better and nowhere near my ex's levels of crazy. Story 31, I ran cross-country in high school. After one meet, as our team was loading onto the bus, I noticed a girls' team huddled around one of their own, who was having some post-race difficulty. This girl, though exhausted, was still rather cute. So I decided to play it cool and offered her one of our water bottles. Hopping off the bus at 16, I wasn't confident enough to ask for her name or number. I was just hoping for a smile from a pretty girl. After all, where could it have led? Her team and mine represented 2 high schools located an hour and a half apart. 3 years later, I was talking about running with my new college girlfriend when we discovered that we had both been runners at a few of the same meets. She remembered a boy in a light blue uniform who approached her when she was exhausted and offered water. At the time, she thought, "Oh God, are you seriously going to ask my number now?" But he made an impression on her when he asked if she was okay, then smiled and walked away. I mentioned that our team wore light blue uniforms, and we soon discovered that our recollection matched. We had been at the same park, in the same season, and in fact, had first met that day years ago. That girl is now my wife of 10 years tomorrow. We even have video and photos my parents took of us standing side by side on the starting lines with our future spouses, completely unaware of what was to come. Be kind to everyone you meet. You never know if your paths will cross again. Story 32. This actually happened to my brother, but I love the story, so I'll tell it anyway. My brother moved away from home for university and then, once he finished, moved again to Toronto, about 8 hours away from our hometown. While there, he met a girl, probably through a friend. As they talked, they realized they had actually gone to the same school in grades 7 and 8. They didn't remember being particularly close back then. After junior high, she had moved to China to finish high school, so whatever connection they had was lost. Skip forward a bit, and these two start dating. They both come back to our hometown for the holidays, since both of their parents are living in the same town again. When my brother visited her parents, he said he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been in the house before. The parents insisted that was impossible. They'd owned it for 30 years, but he kept insisting. So her mom pulled out a book she had for all guests to sign when they came to the house. They flipped back to the years when they'd gone to school together. And sure enough, my brother's little signature from grade 7 was in there. Under reason, he had written school project. They both had forgotten that they had worked on a project together back then. And now, 5 years later, they are married with 2 beautiful daughters. Story 33. I was on a road trip from San Francisco to San Antonio for a wedding. During the trip, my friend and I decided to climb Mount Whitney. We only had 2 days to spend on the mountain, as we had a tight schedule to get to the wedding in San Antonio. After covering over 14 miles of trails, I reached the bottom of the mountain and realized I had lost the rental car keys. We both freaked out trying to figure out a plan to get a new key shipped to us and so on. We went to a little burger joint at the bottom of the mountain, and while discussing what we should do, the guy sitting next to us asked what kind of car we were driving. We told him it was a Mustang, and he said, "I have your keys. Do you mind if I finish my burger before I get them for you? They're in my car." It turned out the guy had spent a couple of weeks in the wilderness, and by sheer coincidence, he returned the same day we finished our 2-day trip, and happened to eat a burger right next to us. He wouldn't even let me give him gas money or pay for his burger. Good man. Story 34, I was on vacation at Disney World when I was 15. I was standing in line for Space Mountain, about to get on the ride, when I heard someone call my name. I looked behind me, and about 10 people back in line was a girl I had gone to school with for the last 7 years. Neither of us had any idea the other was on vacation there. Another coincidence happened when I got hired at my current job. On my second day, I had a meeting with the VP of my department. Later that night, I was telling my wife about meeting him, and she thought he sounded familiar. It turned out he had married my wife's godmother's oldest daughter and had known my wife since she was 3 years old. My final story is probably the strangest. When I was 4 or 5, one of my aunts got married on Mackinac Island. Naturally, I was in some of the photos taken at their wedding. Fast forward about 20 years, and my wife, then girlfriend, and I were at my aunt and uncle's house for Christmas. My wife was looking at some photos on the wall and asked why they had a photo of her uncle. It turned out that one of the groomsmen at the wedding was her uncle. It really is a crazy small world out there. Story 35. My wife, 26, and her family immigrated to the U.S. from the Republic of Georgia in 1997. A couple of years ago, we were engaged and planning our wedding. We were looking for a non-religious officiant, and our wedding coordinator gave us a list of 8 professionals to check out. We contacted one of them and arranged to meet him for lunch at a ramen restaurant to see if he was the kind of officiant we were looking for. We chatted and got to know each other over the meal. I mentioned that my wife and her family are from the Republic of Georgia, and he said, "Oh, I love Georgia. I went there once long ago. Such a beautiful country." My wife was so excited to hear that. It's rare to meet an American who has been to Georgia. He said, "Yes, I'm a filmmaker. And I was there in 1990 doing a documentary about a Georgian energy healer." That's when it got really strange. My wife said, "That's really odd. I'm a filmmaker, and my mother is an energy healer." Still not thinking much of it, she told him her mother's name, which he couldn't quite recall, and they tried to retrace the timeline to see if there was any chance it was the same person. We all had chills as they talked. It ended with him saying he would go through his old footage, find a picture of the woman he thinks might be my wife's mother, and send it to us when he got home. On our way back home, my wife called her dad from the car and asked if there was any chance her mom had been in a documentary about healers in 1990. Her dad said, "Yes." "Why?" She asked, "Was it made by American filmmakers?" Again he said, "Yes." She told him the name of our officiant and quickly realized he was the director of the film her mother had been in. After hanging up in disbelief, her phone buzzed with a text message, an old black and white photo from Reverend Stu, her mother. Energy healing. Wild. This made for a fantastic opening story at our ceremony. Story 36. I have a pretty uncommon name in the U.S. It's Sicilian. I was working at a fine dining restaurant and got sat with a 3-top. Mom, dad, and a daughter about 8 to 10 years younger than me. I introduced myself saying, "Hi, I'm Ratat. I'll be your server this evening." The mom immediately said, "Oh, my daughter's name is Ratat." I explained that I'd never met anyone else with my name before, though I was aware of a soccer player at our university who shared it. Then I asked how and why they had chosen the name. The mother told me a story about her struggles with fertility. She and her husband had even been thinking about adoption. This happened at least 23 years ago. She said she was grading papers at a colleague's house, sitting on the back patio when the neighbor yelled, "Ratat, come home, please." She turned to her friend and said she loved the name, and that if she ever had a baby, that would be the name. A little while later, she and her husband traveled to Russia and visited an orphanage. They were introduced to a baby girl with white hair and blue eyes, and her name was Ratat. They fell in love with the little girl and brought her home. I asked the mother where her friend lived, and she told me the exact street. It turned out that little neighbor girl was me. I was absolutely stunned. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. All those years ago, she had heard the name just once, and it became her daughter's name. I spent the rest of my shift in awe, completely blown away. What were the chances of that? Story 37. I live on the west coast of Australia, but when I first arrived, I was traveling along the east coast. I had a friend living on the Gold Coast, so I obviously reached out to crash at his place while passing through. As luck would have it, he had just moved into a new place where the landlord was trying to replace 3 tenants who had recently left, so there was a spare room available. The last tenant had left a few of his belongings behind. Nothing valuable, but there was a phone charger that matched my phone. It was an older Samsung with the long, flat connection. Jackpot, since my own charger needed an adapter for the European plug. I spent a few days there. The landlord lived downstairs, and we stayed upstairs. He was a nice guy, but always found ways to get us to help out. In the 5 days I was there, we felled a tree, helped dig the pool, and painted the fence. After that, I left and continued my travels. About a year later, I was staying in a hostel in far North Queensland, in a fairly remote town. I met a lot of great people, many drinks were had, and I ended up staying a couple of months. About a month in, another guy arrived who was from the same country as me, so we quickly became good friends. He was trying to show me pictures of people we might have both known, but his old phone was dead. As it happened, we had the same type of phone, so I gave him my old charger since he already had an international adapter. The day we both left, we went our separate ways. I headed up to the Daintree Rainforest, a stunning place by the way, while he traveled south along the coast. I spent a few days in the Daintree and then started making my way south towards Sydney. One night, I pulled into a rest stop just south of the Gold Coast to sleep. And who did I see but my friend from the hostel? He jumped in my van and we got completely smashed. He had a bottle of whiskey, so it seemed like the obvious thing to do. Many drinks later, we were chatting, and I asked how it had taken him so long to get there. He said, "I frigging stopped off at my old house to grab some things I left behind and the landlord had me hanging doors." He was a carpenter. I asked, "Is your landlord's name Dennis?" He looked at me strangely and said, "Yeah?" Then I gave him the address. He looked at me like, "Okay, are you stalking me or what?" It turned out that the place I had crashed in was his old place, and the charger I liberated from the spare room had been in his old bedroom, hence his phone being dead. I had met him probably a couple of 1,000 kilometers away and given him my old charger simply because I found an Aussie one. It still amazes me now, even writing it out. Finn. Story 38. I absolutely love to tell this story. When I was 24, I met a woman at a party. We hit it off and decided to go on a date. The first date went well, so on the second date, she offered to make me dinner at her apartment. I had lived in Alaska my whole life, but she had grown up in California and moved here just 6 years earlier. The first decoration she bought when she moved was a print of a stylized painting of a raven she found at a thrift store. It was very distinctive, with colored squares running down its back, making it look a little like a jester. So, I'm on my second date with this woman, looking around her apartment at the various decorations on the walls when I stop at the raven painting. It looks so familiar that I say, "I think my grandmother painted this." Another copy of the print had hung in my childhood home my entire life. Sure enough, my grandmother's signature was in the corner. After she retired from teaching, my grandmother had started a second career as a local artist, and the raven was the only painting she ever made prints of. 2 years later, we got married, and my grandmother gave us the original. We now have 2 children and will celebrate 10 years together this August. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.